Well, first of all, good evening. I'm delighted to welcome all of you this evening to the book launch of The Indians, Histories of Civilization by Professor G N Devy, one of the three authors of this book. And of course, Tony Joseph and Ravi Korisettar, who is right here. So it's indeed a great privilege to have Professor Devy in Bangalore and at the NCBS. And I've been invited to introduce Professor Devy, who holds the Obaid Siddiqui Chair in the History and Culture of Science at the Archives at the National Center for Biological Science, a center of the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research. I wish to say a few words about what this chair is, and of course, about Obaid Siddiqui. I seek your leave to say a few words about Obaid first, and then Professor Devy next. Obaid was one of the pillars of modern science in newly independent India. Obaid had returned to India from a very successful career in the UK and in the US as a biologist to help in building modern biology in this country, starting with the establishment of the molecular biology unit at the TIFR in Bombay in 1960. What he established then led to the creation of the National Center for Biological Science in Bangalore in the 1990s. Obaid accomplished this and many other things under the umbrella of the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research, where he served as Professor Emeritus, in fact based at NCBS in Bangalore until his untimely demise in 2013. Obaid leaves behind NCBS as one of his many legacies, and I must say a few words about NCBS too. It is indeed a world-class institution, even if I may say so as its former director, deeply engaged with exploring biology across scales. And that's relevant to today's discussion, exploring biology across scales from molecules to ecosystems with a profoundly interdisciplinary lens. Located at the northern end of the city, NCBS spawned the Institute of Stem Cell Science in Regenerative Medicine, a place for biomedical translation, and the Center for Cell and Molecular Platforms, one of the top biotech incubators in the city. And also now a new institute called the Tata Institute for Genetics and Society. All these four institutes are part of what we call the Bangalore Life Science Cluster, an ecosystem for the life sciences at the northern end of the city. And I would welcome all of you to come and visit when possible. But I must add that all these efforts are testimony to the founding principles of open-minded inquiry and societal engagement, something that both Obaid and Devy share. So we felt a strong need to create a chair who would lead an effort to bridge the sciences, social sciences, and humanities, and help to continue to nurture a diverse and inclusive community of academics across disciplines. A chair, the Obaid Siddiqui Chair, in fact, is invited to spend a year at our campus, and this was made possible by generous support from T&Q Technologies and the foresight of its chairperson and managing director, Miriam Ram, who also knew and admired Obaid, and I'm sure she would have, and she knows and I think admires Professor Devy too. And of course, all that they stand for. And I thank Miriam for her support and faith in us to, in fact, commit this chair for the next several years. Professor Devy is, in fact, the second Obaid Siddiqui Chair in the History and Culture of Science. The first chair was an ecologist, M.D. Madhusudan, who was one of the founders of the Nature Conservancy Fund. And Professor Devy has been with us since September 2022. I will provide a brief summary of Professor Devy's career. He's a renowned literary scholar, historian, social and cultural activist, and a Padma Shri awardee. Professor Devy studied literature at Shivaji University in Kolhapur, and then Leeds, and then did his PhD back in Shivaji University, and then joined the Department of English at Maharaja Sayaji Rao University in Baroda, where he became professor. In 1996, he founded the Adivasi Academy and the Bhasha Research and Publication Center, organizations dedicated to studying and conserving Indian languages, championing tribal art and literature, and uplifting Adivasi communities through educational and financial assistance. He has written over 25 influential books and compilations in English, Marathi, and Gujarati. Professor Devy is perhaps best known for establishing the People's Linguistic Survey of India, a linguistic survey launched in 2010 to update existing knowledge about languages spoken in the modern republic of India. The survey is conducted by a huge number of volunteers, 3,500, I gather, and included 2,000 language experts. And the staff of the Bhasha, and the entire staff of the NGO, the Bhasha Research and Publication Center. This 35,000-page survey is being published in 50 volumes and has identified over 780 languages in this modern Republic of India. Since he left Gujarat, Professor Devy has located himself in Dharwad, close to the Kalburgi family, with whom he shares a deep and abiding faith in rationalist thinking. When we heard he was interested in connecting linguistic diversity with the diversity of the people of India, we were naturally delighted that he would consider to come to work at NCBS as the Siddiqui chair. Whilst at NCBS, he ran a number of engagements, including a course, The People of India, that brought together various disciplines: genetics, prehistory, archaeology, linguistics, philosophy, culture studies, and literature, in order to provide a unique and comprehensive picture of who we are and how we have evolved through the millennia as people of many origins, languages, worldviews, and cultural identities. He has conducted several monthly informal discussions at the archives on a variety of issues that concern society at large, including the practice of science today, something that we actually enjoyed having a discussion with him on very recently. In fact, as part of the Ubaid Siddiqui chair, Professor Devy consented to deliver a set of lectures which ended last week, where he produced an extraordinary set of talks at the Mount Carmel College on the idea of India as a linguistic civilization, with a focus on heritage, diversity, and future about languages and its people across 3 days. These lectures were packed to the hilt, like in this room, but there were many more younger people there. And he grappled with the very question that is central to the existence of India today as a pluralistic society. For those interested in these lectures, they will be available on our website at the archives at NCBS very soon. And I hope Professor Devy will write another book on this subject. It was an incredibly thought-provoking set of lectures. But this brings me to the reason why we are gathered here this evening, to launch this book edited by Professor Devy, Tony Joseph, and Ravi Korisettar, The Indians' Histories of a Civilization. I must say, I have just started reading this book, and I can attest that for anyone who wishes to understand the deep history of this geography and its people, it's a must-read. Given the current attempt to rewrite the history of this geography and its people in terms of a project driven by religious fundamentalism, this book and its genesis is scholarly and a very timely counterpoint. As a scientist, I relate to the highly interdisciplinary nature of this effort, from describing the origins of our population and the different waves of migration into this land, and its unique population structure imprinted in the DNA analysis of our ancients, to a very insightful linguistic analysis of the origin of Indian languages, religious movements, political and social transformations right up to this date, Its scope is truly breathtaking and vast, spanning 12,000 years of history, and it is excellently curated. Each article that I've read so far is scholarly, and one wants to delve deeper into the issues that these articles bring out. I certainly look forward to the many parts that this book is likely to lead me to explore, and I thank the authors for this incredible effort. I'm certainly looking forward to the discussion this evening. Thank you very much for coming.
It is difficult to decide if time at all exists, and it is not but an imagined absolute. Leaving aside the metaphysical uncertainty, it is necessary to accept that human affairs carry upon them a deep imprint of the unceasing interplay between the past and the present of all individuals, as well as forms of their collectives, whether families, societies, or nations. Depending on the material, cultural, and ideological expediencies of a given present, societies and nations conceptualize, constitute, inhabit, and represent their past, rather their several and ceaselessly shifting pasts. Being forever in the process of getting restructured, no single version of the past can admit the test of absolute authenticity. Notwithstanding these known uncertainties, the established conventions of scientific discourse of history expects the conversations about a society's past to keep a safe distance from fantasy, hallucination, and wishful nostalgia. The many-ended openness of history as a field of inquiry allows majoritarian politics and autocratic regimes to replace the narrative of history by irrational and untenable claims. They tend to raise the pitch of hatred for perceived injustice at the hands of ancestors of the people against whom the sentiment of revenge is sought to be invoked. In order to bolster up the self-esteem of the dominant sections of society, such regimes concoct illusions of a glorious past era as the essential, of the people they intend to control and lead. No matter how farther from the truth, such claims drive narratives of the past cautiously constructed by professional scientists, archaeologists, and historians, and no matter how they marginalize real achievements of the past. Present-day India is a living example of this pattern of reimagining history, willfully brought to depart from its established and academically rigorous narratives. The genesis of this book lies in the contestation unfolding before us in the recent years between the scientific view of history and the ideologically charged attempts to distort the history of South Asia.
The increasing tendency under the ruling dispensation to exclude wide swathes of the country's population from public life, participatory citizenship, and the possibilities of enhancing their prospects in life is particularly painful in India. It is a truism that there are no permanent friends or enemies in a world grounded in realpolitik. And today, China is emerging from the standpoint both of Indian foreign policy and the country's middle class as India's greatest enemy. Such a view suggests how far the civilizational ethos has been replaced by the gaze of the nation-state, occluding the long history of the links that bound the two countries together. Similarly, though I can do little more than make the point at this juncture and hope that others will pursue this line of inquiry, India's history of links with East Africa, the Gulf, Southeast Asia, West and Central Asia, and Iran has also been obscured by its relatively more recent history of encounters with the West. Rabindranath Tagore's visit to China as an honored guest in the 1920s points to the various ways in which China looked up to India, and that too at a time when India was under British rule, as an elder brother, and as a fount of civilizational wisdom and resilience. What Tagore had to say in one of these lectures to his Chinese audience is not less remarkable. In trying to capture for his listeners what he took to be the distinctiveness of India, Tagore pointed to what he called dharma. Drawing upon his own experience, Tagore related to his audience how, on a motoring trip in the Bengal countryside, the engine of the car in which he was traveling heated up every now and then. And though there was a drought in every village that he passed through, the villagers at every turn readily parted with the little water that they had and refused to accept payment. What made them do so, Tagore asks. Had they followed the inexorable law of demand and supply, they could have made a tidy sum of money. But to sell water would be like asking them to sell their life. They were impelled, one might say, by certain traditions of hospitality. And yet, there is more to it. They are driven by their dharma, and there is something endearingly simple in their conception of dharma. But that simplicity is a product of centuries of culture. Far away at the other end of the country, it is the same notion of dharma that made it possible for Masood villagers who had been bombed from the air by an English pilot to shelter and nurse to health, the very same pilot when his plane caught fire and he had to do a crash landing which left him injured. The advocates of a Hindu Rashtra, the foot soldiers whom they have deployed on the streets and on the byways and alleyways of the internet, and many in the middle class who nurture a deep sense of grievance about the 1,200 or more years of alleged servitude under which their ancestors served, have been so busy in identifying, shaming, pounding, and terrorizing those they imagine as foreigners or traitors amongst themselves, that they have become foreigners to themselves. They are incapable of recognizing the dharma of their civilization. Mohandas Gandhi believed himself to be a devout Hindu and openly characterized himself as an adherent of the Sanatan Dharma. But he bequeathed to the country his far-reaching understanding of the dharma of Indian civilization. In its institutional form, it took the shape of an extraordinarily ecumenical prayer meeting with which he had started experimenting in South Africa, and which evolved into a call for intercommunal harmony, the serenity of which would be shattered willfully by his assassin on the evening of the 30th of January, 1948. In the form of his own religious belief, Gandhi's understanding of the Dharma of India entailed the notion that the Muslim was incomplete without the recognition of the Hindu within him, just as the Hindu was incomplete without the recognition of the Muslim within him. We remain strangers to ourselves unless we learn to tolerate, if not cultivate, the otherness of the other in ourselves. I would like to think that the papers in this volume make Indians aware of who they have been, where their dharma has led them as a people, and as the carriers of a certain civilizational ethos and the past that they must call to mind to keep their ethical grounding and prevent the dharma of their very being from being spirited away from them.
Namaste. Good evening, everybody. I'm extremely delighted to see the hall overflowing with the people interested in the Indians. I'm given about 10 minutes to share my experience in the production of this particular book and give you a slight background. And before I describe the contents of this book, partially, because the rest of the book will be dealt with by Dr. Ganesh Devy. The other day, during the question and answer session following a lecture by Professor Devy at Mount Carmel College, someone asked him how it was possible to present 12,000 years of history in the space of 1 hour. And his answer was certainly obvious, and you could guess what that obvious question and answer was. Similar question is expected from you here, whether we can deal with such a vast time period in one volume. The answer is both yes and no, yet we have made it possible in 640 pages. I recall I was new to the discipline of history and archaeology. It was at the post-graduation level that I entered into this particular field. And similar question, and I was introduced to this subject, the discipline of history and at the postgraduate level. And we were advised to consult a series of volumes published by the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, Mumbai, and then another series published by the Ramakrishna Mission in Kolkata called The Cultural History of India and so on. And these series published by these reputed institutions were the only source of knowing India's past at that particular point of time, nearly 50 years ago or so. But over the years, the disciplines of both history and archaeology have grown and have contributed to more and more deeper understanding and obtaining new insights into our past and so on. On the other hand, we were also advised to read History of India Volume 1 by Dr. Robin Thapar. And then it was only a 300-page book which covered the entire ancient period, covering more than 2,000 years of India's past and so on. And at the same time, we were also advised to read one of her another contribution called Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas. When the entire history of India could be written in 300 odd pages, the Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas also was written in 300 and odd pages. And that was a perplexing experience that I had. And so I began to wonder that history can be written in so many ways. And entire history of India in one volume and a part of the life of an emperor in another equally thick volume. As a student of archaeology, I also began to wonder if the 2,500 years history of India could be written in multiple volumes, how many such volumes will be required to write 2.5 million years history of man, on this planet. So that is what is called prehistoric period. So prehistory is much more vast and very, very deep in time. And then the evidence that, that is available for writing prehistory is much more complicated and complex compared to writing the history of any particular region. Several institutions across the country have embarked on producing up-to-date accounts of Indian history, including prehistory, such as Vivekananda International Center in New Delhi, and also the Mythic Society in Bangalore. So multiple volumes covering various time periods of India's past, including prehistory and protohistory, are being produced, and some volumes have already seen the light of day. But what worries us most, three of us who are sitting together and discussing on this particular history, is some autonomous institutions such as Indian Council of Historical Research and the committee constituted by the Ministry of Culture, Government of India, have initiated steps to rewrite Indian history. I don't elaborate on this particular word, rewrite. As discussed by Dr. Devy in this first volume, a part of it was read to you just now, and we came together, and as editors, we would like to reiterate that history expects the conversation about a society's past to keep a safe distance from fantasy, hallucination, and wishful nostalgia. And that the main objective of history should be providing justice to the society at large. With these objectives in mind, we embarked on this project. Dr. Devy had been contemplating on this project for quite some time, I believe from 2020 or so. But with the editors, when we came together, it was followed by a series of online meetings with eminent historians from all corners of the world. And continents and conceived this project. And we were delighted by the positive response of the scholars who helped give a comprehensive scope to the volume. And it ushered in a very, very hard time for the editors to work on the manuscripts which were submitted. It was 2 years of slogging, and it was worth doing it. And finally, the product is there in our hands and also in your hands. Yes, attempts, although it includes a series of chapters, they are basically synopsis. Our plan is to obtain full-length articles, each running into certain length, 50 pages, 60 pages, whatever. And we plan to organize series of volumes, each containing about 3 to 4 articles, depending on the size of each contributor's expanded versions, and bring out a series of volumes. Of course, this is not aimed at surpassing the efforts which are being made by various institutions. But anyway, it may end up in 30 to 40 volumes if we are able to put in our energy and work consistently over the next decade or so that we produce a magnum opus. Our aim is not to surpass, but to adhere to the scientific method and judicious use of recent data and findings. Historians focus on a particular region and communities living in those regions, and archaeologists focus on human biocultural evolution. When both of them combine, the result is a book of this kind. Historians focus on complex societies, archaeologists focus on simple societies. This book is an attempt to combine both of them. With this background, I would like to briefly describe what is written on the blurb of this volume. The Indians is one of the most ambitious projects yet undertaken to map the origins, evolution, and present-day reality of India's civilization and people. Written by over 100 of South Asia's foremost scholars and domain experts, the essays in the book cover a period of some 12,000 years, and it is much more. It goes back to 200,000 years if you glance through this book. From the last ice age to the present 21st century. The book is divided into 7 sections. The first part of the book deals with the evolution of humans in South Asia through the lens of the early Indians population, their migrations, and climate. The second part focuses on the emergence of different civilizations in the region through the domestication of plants and animals and other factors, and how these civilizations eventually begin to decline. The third part discusses the languages and philosophies that defined the ancient India in terms of Buddhism, Jainism, Sanskrit, Indo-Iranian languages, and Pali literature, among others. The fourth part is a detailed study of society and culture in various geographical regions, that is North, South, Northeast, and the Deccan, East, and West India. The fifth part of the book deals with the advent of colonialism and its impact on country's economy, social fabric, and knowledge systems. The sixth part of the book, Adivasis movements, Ambedkarite politics, Gandhian resistance, and other events that would come to form the bedrock of the independent republic. And finally, the seventh part looks at contemporary India, the working of the constitution and urbanism, liberalization, and other aspects of the modern Indian experience. The first 2 sections having been my area of specialization, as I said, this book focuses on 12,000 years of India's past, but it is much more because we have a lot of archaeological evidence which helps us reconstruct the peopling of this particular part of Asia, that is the Indian subcontinent. As you go back in time to 200,000, 300,000, and even more, as I mentioned in the beginning, prehistory has a time depth going back to nearly 3 million years or so. But within the Indian subcontinent, we have evidence that takes us back to 15 to 16 million years ago. So there are these archaeological sites which help us figure out that India was inhabited by what we call archaic hominins. And then the 12,000 period is the recent past of the modern humans, that is all the present humans living across the planet. So the evidence that we have gathered during the last 200,000 years in respect of geomorphological, in respect of climatological, and also in respect of environmental changes have been gathered and put together in a very systematic manner in a couple of essays which are part of the first part of this volume. And they very clearly tell us that human habitation of this area was successful if they were capable of adapting to these climatic and environmental changes and so on. So we have oceanic records, we have continental records, which have helped us in delineating climatic and environmental changes because they have played an important role in the habitability of any geographical region in this area. So although the title of the book indicates that we are covering the last 12,000 years, there are one or two essays which take us back to 200,000 years or so. And then during the last 100,000 years, major part of the Indian subcontinent were inhabited by people who were migrating out of Africa into the Indian subcontinent, but the rate of dispersal into the subcontinent was relatively slower when compared to the rapid movements that were taking place since the emergence of agricultural way of life. So the center of origins of agricultural way of life is located in Southwest Asia. So that center and then the dispersal. So the diffusionary phenomenon has been identified as having played a very important role in the peopling of the world in the last 12,000 years. We may have conquered major part of the Indian subcontinent, but there are different parts of the world which are yet to be colonized by even modern humans with a great deal of technology at their disposal. Yet, they are capable of going beyond the Earth, but on the planet itself, there are some areas where we do not see the presence of human occupation, evidence for human occupation, and so on. So with this background, I will now request Professor Devy to introduce the part which deals with the historical and cultural part of historical time period and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Devy will speak after me. So I'm sort of like batting before Tendulkar, so to say. I'm happy to be Rahul Dravid since I belong to Bangalore. Now, but on a more serious note, I'd like to congratulate the editors, Professor Devy, Professor Korisettar, and Tony Joseph, who's not here, for this rich, stimulating, and within its confines, comprehensive volume on the many histories of our subcontinent. What is truly impressive about this work is the range of themes and contributors. So there's a very wide sweep in terms of themes, disciplinary themes. So there's biology, ecology, language, culture, sociology, and contributors who are of different generations and from different parts of the world, and are all acknowledged specialists in their respective fields. So the generational, disciplinary, cultural, international range is, at least in the sphere of Indian publishing, unprecedented. Now, I would urge each of you to buy this volume as you go out, if you haven't already. So I'm not going to summarize the volume. Professor Korisettar has given a very crisp and succinct and very valuable overview of the early part of the volume, and Professor Devy will come later to speak about the later part of the volume. But as a reader, not as a contributor, I'd like to say a little bit about highlighting some among the many things that impressed me about the book, apart from the disciplinary, generational, and international range. One, which links to, in a sense, Professor Korisettar's realm of speciality, is the distinction that one of the contributors makes between prehistory and deep history. Now, I urge you to reflect on this distinction for a little bit, because human beings, especially contemporary modern human beings who live in villages and towns and can read, have been condescending about the time before writing was invented, before organized agriculture was, became a way of life, before people started living together. And this kind of rubric prehistory, which is kind of not just that there was no history, that we weren't even human, I think is a kind of, as I said, a rather lofty, condescending term to describe a very long, very interesting, and very definitively important past. Many aspects of what we are today culturally, biologically, socially, psychologically, was shaped before our ancestors began to write or began to live, in row houses in a village or in apartment buildings in a megalopolis like ours. So I think that's among the most important parts of the book, is the long-range view it takes, where it's the deep history of humanity on the Indian subcontinent, a long and very interesting and rich and still underexplored period, brushed off in this label prehistory. That's sort of as if it wasn't important or wasn't significant. The second really important part of this book is the attention to ecology and climate. I think, and this is not just to do with the current climate crisis, but has to do with the fact that historians generally take nature for granted, as if it doesn't exist, as if it doesn't shape how we live, as if it isn't variable, unpredictable. And I think the kind of importance of ecology and climate in many of the essays in the volume is distinctive. And along that, plants and animals, so non-human beings, non-human species, and how, of course, in many cases, humans domesticated them for their use. And finally, I could list many such interesting things that struck me about this book. But finally, I'd like to highlight the importance to the Northeast, a region that is, as we see from our newspapers today and what they cover and what they do not cover, a very interesting and important part of India that scholars as much as politicians and journalists and ordinary citizens have scorned, ignored, obscured. Now, I told Ganesh is a very old friend of mine. We go back actually a quarter of a century in terms of our intellectual engagements, which began in Bangalore in the year 1998 and have continued ever since in many different parts of India. And I told him I was going to make a criticism of the book, and of course, in the spirit of open-minded inquiry in which the book has been conceived, he said, please go ahead. So I've got to make one intellectual criticism of the book. As it's within the terms it sets itself, a one-volume analysis of the many histories of the subcontinent. It is, as I said, unparalleled and deeply welcome for scholarly reasons. Not really political reasons, I would say, but for scholarly reasons. And it's wonderful to hear from Professor Korisettar that there are going to be later books in the series that will expand on these shorter essays. But the criticism I'm making is of the current volume, in the spirit of my belief that history is, as the great Dutch scholar Peter Gale once called it, an argument without end. I'd say the one kind of a methodological, maybe not blind spot, but omission in this book is that of the course. And this is, of course, again, maybe something that is to do with how human beings relate to land. And they see water as, at least human beings like most of us in this room. And what rivers and the coast have done in shaping Indian civilization and its multiple histories is something perhaps this book could have paid a little more attention to. One of the important and valuable aspects of this book is that, of course, it talks about agriculture, it talks about urbanization, but it has also a very interesting discussions about pastoral nomadism, which is, who are a very important social group generally neglected in the literature. It talks about Adivasis, it talks about hunter-gatherers, but I couldn't see any reference to fisherfolk, who again, are a very important constituent of our Indian population, or of the role that the coasts have played in shaping Indian civilization. There is a very interesting chapter on India and the Arab world, but a comparable chapter on India and Southeast Asia. I think that's something which may be an omission that could be rectified in any future edition of the book. But apart from this one methodological criticism, I'd like to express my renewed admiration for the vision, the scope, and the sophistication with which this wonderfully valuable and much needed exercise, historical exercise, has been carried out by the editors and their stellar team of contributors. Now I've got to end with some remarks that are not of mine, but come, which were expressed or written by the greatest Indian it was my privilege to know. Now, as a historian, I have written about many remarkable Indians: politicians, writers, activists, cricketers, scientists, social reformers, but I've written about them from the perspective of a historian who's documenting their lives based on archival records. Among the Indians I've met in my 6.5 decades on this earth have been many quite remarkable people, some of whom are in this room, and among them the most remarkable was Kota Shivaram Karanth, whom I met when he was already in his late 80s. I met him 4 times. Each meeting is vividly imprinted in my memory, and if Ravichandra is so inclined, I can come back on a subsequent occasion and talk about each of those meetings. More or less the most reckless thing I've ever done in my career as a writer is to write a column in a Calcutta newspaper where I describe Shivaram Karanth as having been as variously gifted as Rabindranath Tagore. And I did not go back to their city for a few years after that. But when I was reading this book, now by the way, my veneration of Karanth is expressed, among other things, in the fact that there is a bust of Karanth on my writing table, to keep me honest, as it were. But when I was reading this wonderful collection, I was reminded of some words of Karanth, not very well-known words of Karanth. They're not in one of his great novels that you may have read. They have nothing to do with Yakshagana. They have nothing to do with his environmentalism or his drama or all the other things that he's known for. They are remarks he once expressed when asked, when he heard scholars and demagogues talk about something called Aryan culture and even Indian culture in the singular. And he then said, in response to this idea of an Indian culture, a singular Indian culture, and indeed perhaps even an Aryan culture, he said, do these people who use these terms so carelessly realize what transformations this Aryan culture has undergone after reaching India? And then he gives his own opinion of what is Indian culture. And I quote, he says, Karanth writes, Indian culture today is so varied as to be called cultures. The roots of this culture go back to ancient times, and it has developed through contact with many races and many peoples. So the roots of this culture go back to ancient times, but it has developed through contact with many races and many peoples. Hence, among its many ingredients, it is impossible to say surely what is native and what is alien, what is borrowed out of love and what has been imposed by force. I repeat, hence among the many ingredients of Indian civilization, it is impossible to say surely what is native and what is alien, what is borrowed out of love and what has been imposed by force. And then he ends by saying, if we view Indian culture thus, we realize that there is no place for chauvinism. No, I think I've already paid many compliments to this book, all sincere, but I now pay an even greater compliment. The spirit of Dr. Shivaram Karan hangs over this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramachandra Guha. The compliments you paid are rich. And I and Ravi Korisettar and Tony Joseph truly hope that this book becomes deserving of your compliments. This great city of Bangalore, this great historian saying these things, is a good start for a book that hopes to make at least some impact if in this country the future generations think in terms of histories rather than history. Our understanding of our past will be much better. I want to say something about this, but before that, I would like to find out if Rochelle Pinto and Rinku Lamba are in this audience. And if they are here, I would like to invite them here. They have contributed. Please come. Please. Please be seated. Be seated. Dr. Lamba. Maybe in another hall. Okay. Okay. I was not fishing for a compliment. But this point is well taken. Rochelle has done a fantastic essay on the complete history of Goa in a very short space. And it's a history of Goa very different from what most of us think in terms of Goa's history. She lives in Bangalore, and I want to congratulate Bangalore for having such wonderful historians around. Rinku Lamba has written on the question of caste and how we try to reform caste. I want to say something about that, but just before that, if you are comfortable, Rochelle, would you please say a few words about your sense of being involved in this project? Thank you. And while you're speaking, I'm going to occupy that chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Devy, for allowing me to say a few words. And let me also thank you for including me in the project. I have to say, when Professor Devy first wrote to me, he did write with a set of requirements and expectations, but I also want to say how much I appreciated the freedom that he allowed all of us. So even if some of the texts in the book don't seem to be very cohesive, it's actually because we were allowed to respond to our own field and our own sense of the historiography of our own areas of focus. So I'd like to begin by taking, not taking issue with Professor Guha, but just to say that I did attempt in my section on Goa to talk about the coast, and I actually began by saying how most histories, including the history of Goa, tends to be land-centric, an aspect which actually has struck me in recent years because I've actually been looking at land narratives. And what I did try to do actually was to talk about how, just in the 19th century, when there's actually an increase of significance devoted to questions of facticity and evidence, it's actually the point when a Brahmanical myth gets accepted by the colonial state and subsequently by the majoritarian state in Goa, as a sort of founding story of Goa. So the Parshuram myth, which has an exclusively Brahmin sort of connotations, you'll find it reproduced in gazettes, in textbooks, in all kinds of official documents. So it's sort of a reminder that, you know, when we think about history as being based on fact and evidence, how hard historians have to work actually to overturn the stronghold of belief and myth. When that belief and myth is problematic, as we know, belief and myth is not always problematic. The other aspect that I was most grateful to address was, I think, a point that Professor Guha did bring up when he quoted Shivram Karant, which is to say that it's really impossible to address a meaningful history of Goa unless one lets go of this divide between the foreign and the indigenous. I don't mean that it's not significant in any of the anti-colonial struggles, but it's almost like the very fabric of our being. It's not just the fact that the Portuguese were there from the 16th century on, but the ways in which they actually permeated the culture, including the cultures of Hinduism, disallows us actually from making any kind of neat division. And if we are to contend with slavery, with the fact that being of mixed race wasn't always seen as a problem, and even the forms of resistance, you know, there are priests from the 18th century who are writing in Portuguese, using the language of the church to argue against race. It's impossible for us to make these histories visible if we're constantly speaking to a sort of majoritarian conception of, you know, pushing away everything that's foreign, whether it's language, or whether it's religion. When there are these neat divides, so there's a need to constantly reach back to a point where everything is shorn of things that are seen as alien. And the last point I'd like to make is being on the coast and being knit into a kind of, into a history of colonial empire that extended from Latin America to Macau. It's impossible to tell the history even of elite Goans unless one is engaging with the history of Brazil and with the history of China. And this volume allowed me to say all of that in very few words, and I'm really happy for the chance to have done that. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Ravichandran and Bangalore International Center and you for allowing us to present this book to the world. This is the first launch of the book internationally. It will be launched at other places, in Britain, in United States, and in our very dear India at several places. This is the first. So thank you so much. And I want to thank, this is not a Thanksgiving speech. I'm going to begin to speak. Then I also want to thank Professor Satyajit Mayer for giving me space to work in Bangalore as Obed Siddiqui chair professor. I miss Tony Joseph, he's in Australia, but we shall send the recording of this program to him. And Ravi, of course, thank you for being part of this wonderful journey. History in India has been in, history writing in India has been in continuous progress ever since the Mughal times, when we have people like Al-Baduni, but after William Jones, through the 19th century, the entire 20th century. And if one were to go to a truly respectable library of his books on history, one would need at least a month's time to look at each book for a second or a split second. Huge amount of literature on the past exists. And yet, like Coleridge said, water, water everywhere, but not a drop of water to drink. There are some enigmas in our past, which India still needs to resolve, understand, rationalize, and imbibe. One is, of course, which is more popular, most popularly known, the script, if at all it was script used in Harappa, I mean the Indus civilization. One doesn't know if it was script or they were only marks used for trading purposes. There are lots of debates, but there is no conclusion on that. And then there is a period of about 500 years after the fall of after the vanishing of the Indus civilization to the emergence of a new kind of lifestyle, ideals, cosmology and theology in the form of the Vedas. Those 500 years also require a more exhaustive archaeology and historical research. I mean, these are known areas where we do not know. I mean, we know that we don't know enough, but that's fine. But there are things which we think we know about, but we do not know enough. And that is, we still haven't figured out. We know about Varnas. Literature speaks of how the Varnas came up. But we don't know sufficiently well about the ground rules of the dynamics of caste emergence. Anthropologists, sociologists, historians, they've done a lot of work. But if I have asked a number of friends as to when the tribes of India, which are non-jatis, either you are Adivasi or you belong to a tribe, you belong to caste, why come these have been out the jati, I have not found a satisfactory answer. Answers there are, but not a sufficiently convincing answer. We all belong to the same genetic pool, stock, same geographical, climatic zone, but so there is some work to be done on the question of caste. Is emergence. We'll be able to solve that. We'll be able to clear up the mess created by the caste divisions only on understanding its exact genesis, development, and dynamics, intercaste dynamics. There is a third area which is even more perplexing for me as an Indian. I love my saint poets. Of course, Basveshwar here and Akkama Devi, but Jnaneshwar, Tukaram, Eknath in Maharashtra, Mira, Kabir up there in north, the Oriya and Bangla saint poets, and Saint Shankar Dev in Assam, and so on. Bhakti is the term that is used as a kind of hold-all term for all these new sectarian, creative thinkers, poets, thinkers, social leaders. We all know that they emerge. And how often have we not actually quoted Kabir or Mira or Tukaram? Or they are part of our everyday life or consciousness across social classes, across castes, across communities. Yet we do not have enough understanding of why precisely this tremendously progressive rebellion or revolution came up. I mean, just as we know how Catholic Church to Protestant Church, that entire journey, we know a lot more about that than we know about our own past during the last 1,000 years. Maybe you can stretch it back by a century or two if you begin from Tamil Nadu. 1,200 years. If we do not know sufficiently well about the last 12,000 years, if we do not know sufficiently well about the exact genesis, growth and dynamics of the caste over the last 2,000 years, then we need to know more closely, with a greater interest, with a greater engagement in the area. This volume does not provide answers to all of those enigmas, Towards the end of his life, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar wrote that wonderful book, the Enigmas of Hinduism. Perhaps he did not have money to publish that book. That's despite having been part of writing the Indian Constitution. This is the last 2-3 years of his life. It was published posthumously. Just as he was writing about the enigmas of Hinduism, we have to write about the enigmas of being in India. And it is these unresolved areas of our past that provide a very fertile ground for myth making. I mean, we cannot deny the fact that Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated on 30th January 1948. It's fact, known for fact. But we just don't know how Tukaram died. And it is there, very, kind of myth making and misleading interpretation or representation become possible. These misleading interpretations can sometimes impact our social life, our corporate life, our dealing with other humans in the country. It certainly did about 100 years back. We are in 2023. 1923, a document was written. It was called the Essentials of Hindutva. And it said that who can be the citizens of India? Who can be the nationals of India? Who can have nationality in India? And the answer given in that document 100 years ago was that those who belong to this land, but those whose religion also, the birth of whose religion belongs to this land. Now those assumptions, those assertions were based on an inadequate understanding of history. And I'll explain at some, there is a very fine essay by Rajesh Kochhar in this book. Unfortunately, he died. He was an astrophysicist. He moved to history. He wrote a wonderful book on the Vedic people, the geography and history. His essays in that book, if you decide to read only a few, do read that essay definitely. Rajesh Kochhar did very close research and figured out that the Saraswati of the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization actually is located, is a river and in a network of other 6 rivers making Sapta Sindhus in what is today's Afghanistan. If that is the Punya Bhumi of people like you and me, whose Pitru Bhumi is Bangalore, then this question of nationality, nation, constructing a nation, making it, it is a sheer coincidence that some other meeting is taking place in Bangalore outside and I am discussing this. I have no direct link with any of that. Is the same, I mean, I am giving these examples, but if I were born in Russia, USSR, and if I were to read Stalin's recreation of history of the Slavic people, I would have said similar things. Truth matters because it gives light to us, it lights up our path towards the future. Only obsession with the past, only a nostalgia can create a sick society. But a society which knows how to engage with the past constructively, creatively, critically, saying that the good and great things in the past were good and great, but the awful things in the past were awful, and move to future in order to create a more human society. That is the purpose of history. And in India, many communities for the last several centuries, several thousand years, have tried to move forward taking light from the past. This book is the histories of those people. We are a forward-moving people. We're not, we normally grumble that people are indifferent to history. Professor Korisettar tells me that Karnataka is literally littered with proof of existence over the last 45,000 years, or did you say 20 lakh years, or 2 lakh years? I mean, I even cannot count the zeros. I mean, I'm very bad. Littered, but we are walking. We walk over those evidences, and we are people like that. It's okay. I mean, there's nothing bad. If we inherited that, if I imbibe that, the dharma that Tagore speaks of, when people offered their drinking water, keeping themselves thirsty for running his, failing engine of his car, that's our dharma. But we have come into a time when everything else was exhausted. History started getting used for gaining power. We need to move forward to a time when history can be used as aid for our moving forward as a humane, as a civilized, as a federal society which respects diversity and every human being. I am immensely grateful for your giving time this evening to come and listen to our comments on this book. I hope some of you will actually borrow it from your neighbors and the others will actually buy it. But whichever way, I mean, whether in the original or borrowed or Xerox form, whatever, do read it. Do read it. When a nation decides to be reborn, it starts recreating its history. And we must be reborn as a people who understand their history in its entirety, with all the poke marks, blots, glitches, gaps, and not a very nicely finished plastic-looking, very like a big statue or some that kind of history where everything was great, everything was good. If everything was great and good, I am very happy. But then we don't want to get back into the past. We want to. I mean, every day we're going to tomorrow and not yesterday. I wish we could go to yesterday and day before yesterday, and become younger and be born, and then we see our own parents being born and so on. Not possible. Inexorable flow of time will push us forward, and we must move forward with the consciousness of being a democratic, federal country, society with great diversity. Thank you. Thank you so much for your hospitality. Thank you.
Good evening, dear guests. I'm Mandara, research scholar from Christ University. So I wanted to know, as you have already introduced the ambit of this book, I wanted to know how, from environmental narrative to dealing with the system of nation state or the political system created by man, how has the book dealt with this transition? And how do you fit this in one narrative? Because when you talk about the prehistoric period and all, the nature of the evidences is very different when you talk about the independence period. So how has the book dealt with this transition? And maybe in the during the independent times and all, there is very personality-centric and ideological narratives. So how has this book dealt with that transition?
Thank you. Would you like to know or would you like to read the book?
Sir, read it with your insight.
Okay. It's actually, this was the question that Tony Joseph, Ravi Korisettar and G N Devy discussed at great length for about 3 or 4 hours. The question, I mean, the way we put it at that time was as follows. We said, okay, the solar system was created, the Earth was created, then life came up some 200, several hundred crores of years ago. Then humans, Homo sapiens, then different creatures like humans, like Neanderthal, Homo erectus, several species. The worst among them survived, the Homo sapiens. Professor Mayer will tell me. I mean, the others were taller than us. Yet others were better. They had larger hearts. We survived. Having survived, we stuck to the Earth through many climatic periods. And at times, the members of that species died, dwindled in numbers. When the climate improved, once again, there were more leaves, more birds, more trees. They had more to hunt and gather. They multiplied in numbers. But they were there without clothes and obviously no universities. From that point of being natural, how do they become cultural? Or how is the natural man changing into anthropological man, anthropological animal, as a community, using language, and language is the worst weapon they invented. They weaponized language, using fire, shelters. So Professor Korisettar tells me that they took shelter in caves, where they are even painted in, if you go to a place like Bhimbetka. The transition from natural man to anthropological man is a very big leap forward. In that leap forward, climate is a main contributor. Language or sense of community is another. And food shortage at one place, but food availability at another is a third contributor. So migrations, communities, formation, therefore idea of defending themselves, attacking others, using language, and where there was plenty of food available, desire to camp there. So in order to camp, create some shelters, clothing, and so on. This process took a long time. In our book, we used the first 8 essays to describe the life of the Homo sapien as people trying to create small tools, making them more lethal tools, then migrating, then settling, then going in chase of animal and food, and finally actually getting down to pastoral nomadic life. That means it's like the Turner's paintings, greenery, and you have sheep and the shepherd, he can play flute and all that stuff. Very peaceful, which is not peaceful at all. And there's so many bugs in that greenery, and snakes and so on. But the transition to, so we decided to devote about first 8 essays to natural man, and about 8 essays to anthropological cultural man, before man got very greedy, decided to accumulate, create surplus. And it's only when people become greedy, create surplus and accumulate, they start building cities. I mean, I am not saying it to you. But that is, so then the rise of a city civilization, which collapsed. India has a very fine past, which shows that every city civilization India built always collapsed. So that's how we dealt with it. Thank you.
I may like to add one point in this context. The transitions in prehistory are generally governed by the way in which prehistoric communities were successful in adapting to changing conditions. That is more important. So it played a very critical role that whenever there was a climate change, there used to be change in the way the habitat productivity, was affected. So habitat stability was more important. And the climate change was very, very frequent, of the order of 10,000, 15,000 year cycles. So whenever there was an onset of drier conditions, people used to respond. This is human ability to respond to challenges. So that is where we see transitions taking place. But we have to have an archaeological context where we can trace that transition taking place. So this is a general framework that we work in, that environmental change causes culture change. And the processes behind this culture change is to be delineated from the context, archaeological context we identify. That is where there is no problem in identifying transitions or the processes responsible for the transition taking place and so on. It's not a difficult thing at all. It may be a big question for you, but its answers are very simple. Yep.
Just one thing before the next question comes. If we start giving such very long answers, you know what will happen. So ask short questions and we'll try and give short answers.
Here's a short question. You were talking about the origins of the caste system in the country and the lack of clarity about the origins of the caste system. Have I understood that correctly? Okay. So it's clearly mentioned in the Gita, this whole system of caste about Kshatriya, this, etc. It's all very, very clearly mentioned in the Gita. Isn't that the origin of the caste system?
No, Gita mentions Varna, not Jati.
That was short.
Hello, sir.
So, the Gita's view is a quadrilateral, based on four varnas, 4 ashramas, 4 arthas, 4 moksha, etc. So, the chatur varna is mentioned, but jati, like jati is not, Koruba or Vakaliga, that's not there. Varna is there. It is.
Yeah, hello. So, sir, I saw a documentary a while back about how, Hinduism, like the modern day Hinduism, is a mixture of Aryan cultures with like Buddhism and pagan worship. So, your views on that?
Yeah, one thing, Buddhism you mentioned, and we know the date of Gautam Buddha. Roughly, not roughly, 6th, 7th century before Christ. Mahavir was his contemporary with a gap of some 70 or 80 years. Jainism was born. So about 6 centuries before Christ, that means 2700 years before our time. The philosophical concepts in Buddhism are complex, very evolved, philosophically evolved concepts. Similarly, in Jainism, for instance, aparigraha, a concept which Mahatma Gandhi accepted. Now that aparigraha, pari means hand, graha means to hold, grahan karna. A is negative of that. That means not to hold with your hands, not to grab, not to accumulate. Which means you need a society which had started accumulation in order to have that concept. But more than that, to have such a concept, you need a highly evolved language, which means Pali. Buddha and Mahavir use Pali and various Prakruts. So Pali, Prakrut, they are highly evolved in the 6th century before Christ. This much we can admit. It's a historical, I don't want to say fact, historical phenomenon. You go to the south, Tamil, at least as far as I know, the first idea of Sangam appears some 7th century before Christ, same time as Gautam Buddha. And that is, a proto-Dravidic language exists, a proto-Pali, various Prakruts, they exist. And I must also add, Suniti Kumar Chatterjee was a very great linguist who worked on Indo-Aryan languages. But his contemporary was Maheshwar Niyog in Assam, who was talking of a precursor of Assamese, ancient Assamese, independent. Now, it is in this context that Sanskrit comes in around 14th century before Christ. It starts knocking on the doors of South Asia and slowly trickles in, percolates in. And by the 7th century, when Brihad Aranyak Upanishad was composed, which is the first major Upanishad, Sanskrit has settled in India. So imagine 7th century before Christ period, 2800 years before, there is Sanskrit coming in through Punjab. There is Pali and Prakrit in Biju Patnaik and Mamta Banerjee's. There is a Proto-Assamese, there is a Proto-Tamil here. Very fascinating encounter, an intermixture. This idea of Aryan people is a misleading idea. Hitler capitalized a lot on Aryan people, pure Aryan blood and all that. It was a result of a 19th century French linguist who proposed that people in Nordic area, somewhere in North Europe, were Aryans. That was the original home of Aryans. Towards the end of the 19th century, it was a favorite hobby of linguists and thinkers to decide where the Aryans used to live in remote times. Even Lokmanya Tilak wrote a book, the Arctic Home of Aryans. Arvind Ghosh also writes something about this. That was the trend at that time. Just as today's people write about artificial memory, they were writing about Arctic. It was the intellectual fashion of the day. Hitler, this Indo-Aryan was not a name of a people, it was name of a language, which 100 years before that, Sir William Jones had imagined that there is an Indo-Aryan, Proto-Indo-Aryan, Indo-European language, and in that language, the term Arya in Sanskrit and Arya in Persian, ancient Persian is seen. Incidentally, this Arya, Bho Arya, means hey you, hey guy. Bho Arya, that's it. It is called intimate personal pronoun in linguistics. Means pronouns are I, you, we, I, we, you, he, she, it, they. These are pronouns. But instead of these words, some other word is used. जैसे हिंदी में यार, they don't say tu, यार. In Gujarati there is aliya. This intimate personal pronoun has migrated from Tamil to right all the way to Iran, and through ancient Persian it has come in the form of Sanskrit back to India. In Hindi we say Are yaar. It is the same. Now this Arya was an intimate personal pronoun, it was not description of a stock of human beings. But that was taken by the late 19th century linguists and early 20th century politicians in Germany as being name of a people. And so that name stuck to people who were moving from steppes, Euro-Asian steppes, down and eastward towards India. So the mixture of Aryans and non-Aryans is not a genetic statement. Our genetic reality is fascinating, and I will tell it to you, but don't tell it to anybody. Our genetic stock is all our ancestral mothers are native, and most of our ancestral fathers had come from outside. I mean, this is what our genes are telling us. मैं क्या करूं?
Sir, No, sir, but you haven't still answered that whether modern day, no, whether modern day Hinduism is amalgam of Buddhism, pagan worship, and alien culture.
We are created as out of conflict between the Vedic, the Sanatan, the non-believing philosophies, Buddhism, Jainism, Christianity, Sufism, Islam. We are a bundle of all of those as we are today. Each one of us, whether a Christian or I'm sure you have celebrated your birthday. Some Christian element, you might have used mehndi or sung a good ghazal. So, not many. In our every musical instrument in India is a combine of at least the string musical instruments, whether harmonium which has wires or sitar. The metal formula for the metal has come from Austria. The tones have come from medieval Islamic civilization. The very foundation of the silence between the notes has come from Afghanistan. We have a note called Gandhar, Sare Ga Ma Pa Da Ni Sa, and that's from Afghanistan. We are imbibed. A.K. Ramanujan, who was from Karnataka, and I think he put it very beautifully that we are like a fruit in which many trees exist in the form of seeds. Very difficult to segregate. The mix-up is there. If you still have a question, then I must engage yet another evening. Thank you. But we'll go to the third question.
Good evening, sir, and ma'am. Apologies, this is slightly a longer question, but I would like to ask it
That
anyway.
is for Dr. Guha, not for me.
It's for the entire panel, if you don't mind. So, historiography in India presents a unique challenge, not only in the lack of a record-keeping tradition in very many cultures, but also the vast range of the primary sources that survive, both in terms of language and medium. Could you please speak to that and how it affected the production of this book? No, of this book.
Oh, of this book.
Sorry. Thank you for the question.
No, I think, where is the questioner? Right. So, if you do read the book, as I said, this book is written, for example, each of the contributors has used different kinds of sources, So someone may have used genetic material, archaeological material, others may have used inscriptions, others may have used narratives, travelogues, historical records, government records. So, it might be, since Rochelle is here, for example, not just this book. So, let me just say this. What the contributors, obviously, I'm a historian of the modern period, so I can only speak mostly to that. But the contributors to this book are of unimpeachable scholarly credentials. Each of them are drawing on, shall we say, decades of research in that field using multiple sources. Right? You asked a very important question. On the one hand, Indians don't keep records. The records that we keep, termites and the monsoon takes care of them. Right? On the other hand, there is a multiplicity of sources. Right? You asked a very important question. Now, it can't be answered in general. For example, if Rochelle would say, for example, to write about early modern Goa, how would you do it? Which would be different from how Professor Korisettar would do it. Or how, for example, there's a very good, one of the essays in this book, don't say it lightly, was actually born in Pakistan. And he's written on Sindh, the first historian of modern South Asia, Manan Ahmed. So how would you write the history of Sindh? Right. Now, so each of these would be different, but maybe Rochelle just say a little bit about what are the kinds of sources you would use to write, say, a cultural or political history of early modern Goa. So that then you get a sense of how each of these specialists has reconstructed their chosen topic through using multiple sources, which may be fragmentary and may be difficult and elusive, but yet you have to find them. So that's it.
Thanks. Yeah, I would say, I mean, I typically, for instance, I would go to a state library because, they'd have printed text from very, from far back, from almost from the beginning of printing in Asia. But I'd also go to the state archives, and to that extent, I'm glad you raised the question, because historians are really dependent on their relations with state archives. And I think that's a real gap that I hope that also gets filled, just as this volume has tried to fill a gap, that historians engage more with the questions of archives and their access to the general public. And in a sense, I think the production of more popular history might actually help that, increase a sort of public interest in what the archives contain, and almost, place a demand on the state to make it more and more accessible, especially in this age of digital technology.
Can I just, while waiting for the next question, just follow up on Rochelle's answer? And I'm much older than Rochelle, so I've been using Indian archives for more than 40 years. And I've seen many of them deteriorate in my lifetime, including state archives. The Maharashtra state archives, which I first started using in the early 90s. You see that deterioration in many ways. One of the archives that is still reasonably well functioning is the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And notwithstanding its name, it has the best collection of papers emanating from the communist movement, the Hindutva movement, the socialist movement, and all the historic opponents from Jawaharlal Nehru. Because that was in the spirit of democracy and diversity, right? And it's got private papers, it's got microfilms, it's got census reports, government records, magazines. And I'm told there is a rumor that the present government wants to shut it down or send it somewhere deep in the suburbs, and God knows what will happen. So I think it's a very important question that the archives that we do have, I mean, both of us we are not ancient historians like Professor Korisettar, who would need different kinds of things to preserve, right? I think it is really a very important question to, and it's not just this government, all governments are culpable. I'm sure there are a couple of retired IAS officers in this room. You don't have to raise your hands. But you know that in every state in South India at least, the punishment posting for an IAS officer is Director of Archives. So I think this is something which we really, but at the same time, one last point I'll make, and is that you can have private archives. So Godrej has, in Mumbai, a progressive Bombay firm has a business archive. NCBS is developing a first trade archive of papers of scientists, and they already have some outstanding collections, including those of Obed Siddiqui, of M.S. Swaminathan, and they have really high-quality archivists who are passionate, capable, and do not treat it as a punishment posting. Now, similarly, Ashoka University, Azim Premji. So I think probably maybe church records, temple records, mosque records, denomination records. I don't know what kind of records the Karnataka mutts keep. I mean, if Janaki Nair was here, she would know. So I think there are ways in which you don't only have to depend on the state. So obviously, one will want the state. And then we'll have to work towards this. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
I have two short questions, keeping in mind the time. Since you're talking about a very interesting subject of ancient India, I wanted to understand from the archaeological point of view and all, what do you have to say about subjects like Viman Shastra, the Pushpaka Viman, etc., etc. And also to make it a little more exciting, we find that Lord Shiva's, the Shivlings are not only found in India but also in South America. I just wanted a reaction on that, and also in Southeast Asia. The second one is for the brilliant Mr. Guha, modern India. Can you tell me when we became a nation? Thank you.
We come into picture only when we have evidence. If there is no evidence, we don't talk about that particular thing as having existed in the past.
Okay, now I can give you my view as to when we became a nation, not a civilization. This book is called The Indians' Histories of a Civilization, so a nation. It's not a currently fashionable view, which you would expect coming from me at this point of time. But I think it's a historically robust view. There is no ancient idea of Indian nationhood. As I understand it, the British artificially, accidentally, and for their own purposes, created a territorial and geographical and political unity of what is now India, what is the Indian or India today. And within that, the freedom struggle gave those people of that territory a moral purpose, a unifying moral purpose. This applies very on how to deal with gender, how to deal with caste, how to deal with language. So the debates on what is an Indian nation, who is an Indian nation, Professor Devy has mentioned Savarkar. Now Savarkar's understanding of who is a true and patriotic Indian is very different from Gandhi's or from Ambedkar's, right? But the debates on who is an Indian, what is an Indian, who is a loyal Indian, who is a patriotic Indian, who is a true Indian, actually only started in the 19th century. And some of those want to invoke a very distant past, you know, because they think we were always one, we were always united, we were always Aryan, right? But this debates only start because the British accidentally unite us. And of course, my view on, I have it, again, if I may, there's an essay of mine and you can listen to it on YouTube. It's called Patriotism versus Jingoism. So you'll get a sense of, you know, since you mentioned nationalism, there are two kinds of nationalism, in my view. One is broadly, there's a patriotism and there's jingoism. So you can get a sense of how these debates started. But the idea there was that always, it's absolute nonsense. That there was always in India, there were people here who were essentially, of course, in the narrative today, Hindus. You know, and even the idea there was something called a unified Hinduism. I mean, the extraordinary diversity of our sects, of our practices. That is, I'm talking about. I speak as a Hindu myself now, right? I'm not talking about the other religious denominations in India, which are also very ancient. I mean, Sikhs and Jains and Christians and Muslims and so on. So I think it is really the whole idea of debating when was India a nation, you won't find it before the 19th century.
The term nation acquired the sense of territorial description only in the 19th century. And in the Bible, nation is used as people. So we have been people. But having a sovereign nation, single nation, that's come to us from the 19th century nationalism, which was popular in Europe. And the European nations which based their idea of nation on a single language, Italy and Germany, France did not base its idea of nationality on a single language. It was liberty, fraternity, and equality. Germany and Italy, single language. They became fascist countries. Thank you. The next question, please.
So good evening to all of you distinguished academics. I'm Joseph. I'm a history major student at the Manipal Center of Humanities, and I'm currently working with the archives. Now, a previous questioner had asked you with regard to an amalgamation of religions in India. I want to narrow that down a bit more further into a topic which I am interested in, which is the southern portion of India. Perhaps you can bring in the west, you can bring in the course here, but with regard to the three Abrahamic religions and how they created a synthesis in India, like in certain rituals of Christians and Muslims in South India, you will see a certain Indianized way. And by Indianized, I'm talking about a Hindu touch to their ceremonies. How would you cover this in your book? Or what's your general comment on it?
Well, after the ancient prehistory, the proto-history, ancient history, philosophies, arrival of languages, all that part is over. We start talking about Indian states. And we don't begin with Delhi, then Rajasthan, then we begin with Kerala. We begin with Tamil Nadu, then go to Kerala. We begin with Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, Telangana, Goa. We begin the imagined map of India, reading the map of India as we imagined it in this book, from the south going to the north. Because humans came here to dwell much earlier, they continued their existence. They developed tools. Not all tools came to us from the north. They developed. So the south has its preeminence in making India that what it is. There is no doubt about that, and we respect that. And after dealing with the south, we go chupke to Gujarat, and then suddenly Punjab and western Himalayan states. Then we go to eastern Himalayan states, northeast, then Bengal, Orissa, then we come to the heartland, the Hindi heartland. So, there's a lot you will sympathize with in our approach to the map of India and how we are climbing the topography there. Thank you.
To your specific question, just one reading. I don't know, you've seen Susan Vishwanathan's The Christians of Kerala.
No,
it's a very fine anthropological monograph which talks about, because, Christians have been in Kerala longer than in any other part of India. And it's an account of their rootedness in the culture, including their borrowings, good and bad. The caste system, for example, which is very much part of. So it's called Susan Vishwanathan, very fine ethnographic study, which will at least answer a little bit of what you posed.
Okay, if I actually read Susan
The Christians of Kerala.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Also, sometimes what we think is Southern Indian, we suddenly discover has come to us from Portugal, or Spain, or Africa, or these here have come to us from Africa. So, it is all one world, so located everywhere.
Would you say that the South was much more diverse in terms of religious and cultural integration? I don't like to use the word
I like to be proud of the South, the East, the West, and the North.
Okay, fair enough. Yes.
Well, of course, in a sense, because Islam and Christianity came to the South earlier, and with the exception of Goa, where Christianity came kind of with the conqueror. Islam didn't really come together. So in that sense, that coasts have a certain openness. I wouldn't say that. Diversity is everywhere. It's true. But see, even in Karnataka, right? Now, one of the problems about homogeneity is that at what level? So everyone, Karnataka is an extraordinarily diverse state. There are at least 6 or 7 different Karnatakas. If you look at, I think Karnataka is justly proud of having produced, 9 Gyanpith awardees. Right. But one of them had a mother tongue which was Marathi, one was Tamil, one was Kannada, one was more fluent in Tulu. So, in a sense, that is probably true of Bihar. Bihar is an incredibly diverse state, by the way. Linguistically, culturally, in terms of cuisine, music. So, that is really our richness, and that is really the indirect lesson of this book. And Ganesh, also in his talk, mentioned diversity. So it's not as if. It may be true that in the politics of the time, the homogeneity is originating from the north and the west, from the state in which Professor Devy is an exile from, which shall not be named. But even Gujarat is incredibly diverse, So in that sense.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to interrupt, sir. I just also want to, maybe we should think about when the term integration actually arises as a political necessity. It's probably a very modern conception, right? So I'd say integrated into what? Because if you're thinking about the coast, there are traders arriving, there are all kinds of people coming, and they're integrating in different kinds of ways, but there isn't a sort of pre-existing unity necessarily.
Okay.
right? So there are different compulsions. They may well have been a sort of pre-Latin Christianity in Goa, which may have been pushed away by the Portuguese. We don't have a defined historical sort of evidence for that yet. But yeah, there are all kinds of people landing up on the coast. They're also landing up on other coasts. It's also about how are those regional histories framed? Do they expel those parts of their history, or do they include them? Right? So that's the question. And I also want to respond to the earlier question about when we become a nation. From some perspectives, if we think about nation as having a sort of common political good that includes everyone, then we're still to become a nation.
I just want to add, in this book, we've taken the position that the timelines for different regions in India for different happenings are not linear. They are wavy. So India became nation in some parts earlier, in some parts later, and it doesn't matter.
Thank you. There was interesting discussion around archives, and especially the different archives and how they need to get more factored into history. I was thinking all along that there are lots of archives and museums outside of India, as we all know, which hold a lot of our content. So is there a focused attempt to kind of glean out history from that? Because people seem to be doing pointed research, but actually if you look at it, Tipu's complete archives, I believe, are in the British Museum. And I read an article that the British Museum itself doesn't have staff, one or two, just to read like 2 roomfuls of archive material. Likewise, I've been researching paintings across museums, and I find 10 copies of the Ramayana with at least 400 illustrations each across 12 museums around the world, and like thrown away like pieces of cadaver, So isn't there an attempt to, or for example, archives of Oman to better understand how the Malabar trade happened and things like that? So is there a focused attempt to at least start somewhere by listing these sources, if not get into them? So I think that's a question to the panel. Thank you.
No, it's a very good question. It would require, it's a very good question, and it could require, of course, a great deal of cooperation and thought from both official and non-government sources. And you're right. I mean, archives pertaining to the subcontinent, primary materials pertaining to the subcontinent, are textual, they're visual, and of the different kinds. Sometimes they're artifacts, and they're spread all over the world. Now, I mean, I can only speak to a very limited aspect of it, which is textual material. And in the days when such cooperation was possible, there was actually a very productive, I'm talking about the 60s and the 70s, there was a very productive cooperation between the National Archives and the British Library, with exchanges. So original material in the National Archives was microfilmed and sent to the British Library, and vice versa. So, when I was a student in the 1980s, obviously I couldn't afford to go to London, and I was working on a princely estate, which is rare to access. And there's a series called the Crown Representative Records, which were actually microfilmed by the British Library by a visionary director of the National Archives, who was a historian and not an IAS officer on deputation as a permanent posting. Right. So it's a very important question. It would require real cooperation by scholars, by curators, and unburdened by jingoism. We have to get, like Vijay Mallya said, we should be on record. Vijay Mallya made a political career saying, I will get Tipu Sultan's sword back to India. Instead, he went to London. All right. So, and of course, so I think that's just, but you've raised a very important question. I think this is something which, now there's a big debate on the Elgin marbles, for example, right? And beyond the political stuff, I mean, how do you get access to, there's stuff about Britain here. I mean, there's stuff about British people here, and they may want it too. It's not just one side, one way. So thank you for raising that question.
In fact, Bangalore people should think of creating archive. Perhaps Venkat, if he's here, he's in the process of creating something for Bangalore. Bangalore can make a beginning. It will be
comment,
very useful.
sir. Just one last comment related to what I mentioned. Maybe a start could also be like saying, hey, take the Panchatantra and trace it to which all languages it has been translated and how did it travel around the world. I was shocked to know that it's available in like 80 plus countries and in so many different languages. And even if you just trace that, that will yield a lot of history. Another example also is like, I was shocked to know that Indonesia has 4 different versions of the Ramayana. Okay, and deep in Sumatra or somewhere,
there's something. So it's like, even if we trace how these went and how these translated, I think we will probably take a few centuries to even get a fathom of what is Indian history. Just my comment. Thank you.
The National Archives also, we find difficult to have access to some documents which are very brittle in terms of state of preservation. They don't provide access to us because they are not usable. They cannot. But they have to do something to make sure that they are usable for researchers. That is the biggest problem.
We have not been good at maintaining archives. Our banks don't have records of people who have borrowed heavily and gone away. Perhaps we want to thank you. Yes, please say.